1 John 2:15 says, "Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him." For the next 3 days, we're going to emphasize the command that we've just read in 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15, which is a real challenge to all of us. This command is a hard pill to swallow sometimes because it gets right up in our business, meets us right where we're at, and is super, super convicting. But I hope that you'll stick with us as we consider this command and the reasoning behind it. Isn't it wonderful when you receive a command and somebody says, do this, and then they go on to explain why they want you to do it? It's a blessing that we have this command, and then we have the reasoning behind it. I want you to notice, first of all, the explicit command. It's found in verse 15, and it's in the imperative form where John tells these people, do not love the world, neither the things that are in the world. Now, it's really important to consider that what John is talking about here in saying the world is not the people of the world. As a matter of fact, we know that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, talking about the people of the world. The word world here in verse 15 and in 16 and 17 as well talks about the system of the age. This is the life of human society as organized under the power of evil, one person said. It is the schemes, it is the philosophy, it is the way that the world operates. It's not the people itself. And the command is clear. That way of working, that way of living, that system, that power of evil, we are not to love. That is, we are not to have a high estimation of it or a satisfaction with it. The Bible has a lot to say about the world. Romans 12, verse 2, we're familiar with this verse, where Paul commands us to not be conformed to this world. And the opposite of that then is to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. 2 Timothy 4 and verse 10, Paul writes of Demas, saying he has left me, he's forsaken me, having, here it is, loved this present world. Demas was attracted to and had affection for the world, and Paul says that he had forsaken him. Ephesians 2 and verse 2, wherein in time past you walked according to the course of this world. There it is. And he goes on to say, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience. And again in Galatians 1 and verse 4, Christ gave himself for our sins that he might deliver us from this present evil world. So the command here is explicit. It's clear. Don't love the world. And then he goes on to say, neither the things that are in the world. Now, when I read that phrase, immediately my question is, all right, what are the things that are in the world? And what he's going to do is in verse 16 of chapter 2, expound on that. And we're going to get to that verse tomorrow in our podcast episode because he describes the things that are in or that are of the world. So let me ask you today, do you or are you finding your satisfaction and pleasure in this world, in the human society that opposes God? What part of your life is in conformity to the world's expectations? Maybe it's your friendships. Maybe it's your language. Maybe it's your entertainment. Maybe it's what you value. Maybe it's what you spend your time on. Maybe it's the voices that you listen to. Maybe it's a self-centered world. So the command is clear. It's an explicit command. But the question is, and what we're going to answer over the next few days is, why should we not love the world? Because in verses 15, 16, and 17, John gives 3 reasons why we should not love the world, why we must not love the world. And what we're going to do is in the podcast today, look at the first reason. And then in our podcast tomorrow, we'll look at the second reason. And then on Friday, we'll look at verse 17 and consider the third reason. The first reason that we cannot love the world is that there is an exclusive condition. Notice what verse 15 says. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. What John is explaining here is that God and the world are mutually exclusive. So you can't say that you know God, that you love God, that you're in God, that you're saved, that you're walking with God, if at the very same time you say that, your actions, your lifestyle, your mindset is worldly. Your love for the world cannot coexist with a love for God. And he says here that if you love the world, if your affections are oriented towards the here and the now, and you are following the schemes and the systems of this age, then the love of the Father is not in you. We cannot love God and love the world. So if our life is characterized by worldly pursuits, worldly pleasures, worldly priorities, then we are proving that we are not really who we say we are. We are not really saved because the love of the Father is not in him. Jesus reminds us in Matthew 6 and verse 24 that no man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. And here's the clear principle. You cannot serve God and mammon. Again, in John 15 and verse 19, if you were of the world, Jesus says, the world would love his own. In other words, if the world loves you, then you're probably of the world. And then he says to his disciples, but because ye are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you. There ought to be, and we ought to feel an opposition to our Christian lives, to our love for God, because that is otherworldly. And James 1 verse 27 says, pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. That's what it means to have a relationship with God. James 4 and verse 4, James calls worldly people adulterers and adulteresses. And he says, know ye not that friendship with the world is enmity with God. You want to be a friend of the world, he says in chapter 4 and verse 4, then you are the enemy of God. That is strong language that James uses. This is strong language that John uses in chapter 2 and verse 15. You love the world. You don't have the love of the Father. You love the world. You're not of the Father. You love the world, James says. You are actually the enemy of God. Think about this in a very practical illustration. If there were a soldier that went out to the battlefield and had a love for both his own country, the country that he was fighting for, and a profound sacrificial love for the enemy, would that individual make an effective soldier? If he ran out onto the battlefield and looked at the enemy and said, "Oh, they're not really that bad. I don't think I'm going to take out the enemy. I don't think I'm going to be aggressive against the enemy. I think I'm going to embrace the enemy and I'm just going to walk over to their side and then I'll walk back to this side." No, you would look at that individual and say, "You are a traitor. Pick a side. You can't be for both sides in this war." And I love what one author said about this verse and considering this illustration. Because the Father's kingdom is at war with the kingdom of this world, the two will never coexist peacefully. So to pledge allegiance to one side, listen, is to declare opposition to the other. May I just say to you in this podcast episode that God cares about what you love. And if you today are actively, willfully loving the world or the things that are in the world, the verdict is clear that the love of the Father is not in you. Now, Christians, as we experience life, it is very important that we abstain from worldliness, that we pursue holiness, that we seek to be unspotted from the world, and to not dabble with the enemy, not flirt with the world, or become comfortable, complacent, or callous towards the world, but that we put on the armor and stand against the wiles of the devil, stand against the schemes of this world, and by God's grace, follow this command to not love the world.